I'm just going to rattle off some facts here, and you can stop watching if you want to, as soon as you disagree with any of them. Immigration is a good thing. Being a racist is worse and more offensive than being accused of being a racist. 6 million Jews were killed in the Holocaust. Oh, lastly, Nazis are bad. Okay, now if any of my upcoming opinions deeply offend or upset you, I'd like to give you some ammunition so that in the comments you can tell me all my opinions are invalid. Ready? Here we go. I hate Stanley Kubrick. I think he makes stupid movies for stupid people. Okay, let's do the essay. Section 1. Introduction. Wolfenstein's always been about killing Nazis. You shoot Nazis, and you stab Nazis, and you blow up Nazis, and you punch Nazis. So, let's go play a Wolfenstein game. Wolfenstein The New Order 2014. You start off flying low over the ocean to the compound of the Nazi general Death's Head. You crash down into the beach and run through the trenches shooting Nazis. You get into the compound and kill some Nazis, and then you sneak around the castle and you kill more Nazis. But then, Death's Head himself appears and captures you and your team, and he's going to dissect one of you. So now, suddenly, you have to choose between two of your friends, Fergus and Wyatt. How can you make this choice? How can you decide whose life is worth more or less? No, this isn't what Wolfenstein's about. Wolfenstein's about killing Nazis and shooting Nazis and punching Nazis. So cut forward in time, and you're in the 60s, chainsawing Nazis and sneaking on Nazis and killing Nazis. Oh yeah! So you bust your friends out of Eisenwald prison, and you find the resistance, and you go on a mission to London, and the guy you're with blows himself up to avenge London. Well, that was weird, but now you're breaking into the Nazi compound, hell yeah, and you're blowing up Nazis and shooting Nazis and killing Nazis and punching Nazis. Turns out this guy, Set Roth, has been sabotaging Nazi infrastructure from behind the scenes. Great, let's go find this guy in a concentration camp. Oh god. But no, it's okay, because Set's going to help us get to the secret vault full of cool tech, and that's going to help us beat the Nazis. Woohoo! You blow up this stupid Nazi bridge, and you go shoot some more Nazis, and kill more Nazis, and punch more get dang Nazis. You're going to go to a Nazi base on the moon and shoot Nazis. You're going to kill all the Nazis on the moon and escape and fly back and crash down into Nazi London and get home as fast as possible, because the resistance base is under attack from those dang Nazis. Oh no! And they're killing everyone and burning down the base, and they've taken your friends prisoner, and they shoot Klaus, and he's dying. No, this isn't right. He's telling Max Haas, who's like a son to him, that he's all alone now. No, this is sad. This isn't right. This isn't what Wolfenstein is about. Or is it? When they signed up to work on Wolfenstein, what Machine Games wanted to do in their new game was take the character of BJ Blazkowicz and expand his actual personality so that he has thoughts and feelings and a complete internal psychology. In an interview in 2014, Jens Matthias, the game's creative director, said,
"We always loved the idea of a prototypical action." I can't do a Swedish accent.
We always loved the idea of a prototypical action hero exterior juxtaposed with a rich and vulnerable interior psychology. What we humans express publicly is often guided by how we want others to perceive us, but when we're alone with the thoughts in our heads, we're free to be completely naked and exposed. We want to give the player access to the headspace of BJ Blazkowicz. As such, whenever you hear his thoughts, they are utterly intimate.
Blazkowicz had always previously simply been a first-person character who existed as a vehicle for the player to kill Nazis, but Machine Games made him into a whole person. In another interview, Matthias said,
"The goal is not to have a protagonist that's so neutral you can project yourself into them. The goal is to have a protagonist that's so relatable that you become them."
All this is to say that Machine Games created something incredible in Wolfenstein The New Order, and that's what I want to look at here. In the next two sections in particular, I'd like to examine how Wolfenstein New Order and New Colossus make the player painfully aware of the very real mortality of the characters, and then how it subverts Joseph Campbell's famous Monomyth. In 2017, when Machine Games released Wolfenstein The New Colossus, it was instantly apparent there were many repeated elements from the first game, despite the sequel also telling its own separate story. I believe this perfectly parallels Machine Games' development of the character of BJ Blazkowicz and the Wolfenstein IP generally, and that's why I'd like to do a slightly aggressive reading of the games, and discuss a potential meta-narrative subtext. I'd also like to talk about the reception of the new Colossus, and why being offended by a game that makes Nazis the bad guys is not a good look. And how the political climate in America shifted between 2014 and 2017 so that the second game was received with such a different and bizarrely hateful attitude. After that, in the second video, because this video is one of a pair, I will be looking at gut punch storytelling in games, what it is, why it's so prevalent, how games use it well or poorly, how some games manage to do without it, and lastly making a case for why Wolfenstein is the absolute best at it. I don't usually like to lay out my essays in the introduction like this, but I am producing 2 videos in this one essay, so I'm going to be covering a lot. Honestly, I've written this introduction more for myself to stop my head from falling off than for you. I guess that's kind of selfish of me. What a shame. Unsubscribed and blocked. Hang on, this isn't the right background. Someone's put an ad in my video background. Who did this? Section 2. Lebensgefahr. In a video examining the philosophy of Antifa, PhilosophyTube host Ollie Thorne pointed out that anti-fascism is a philosophy or a political position and not a full-time job. I was once called an Antifa kiddie by Sargon of Akkad, so I can verify that. In fact, fighting against fascism in a fascist-ruled world would be an exhausting, grueling nightmare. And Machine Games' Wolfenstein is very much aware of that. In fact, it makes use of innovative game mechanics, clever storytelling, and even the basic human condition to make you very much aware of that. The primary way that Wolfenstein makes this apparent is its attitude towards death. Death is really ever present in Wolfenstein. It's like that friend you had over for dinner, and even though you said 5 times now you need to get an early night, you just won't get the hint and leave. The New Order starts with a suicide mission flying low over the ocean. The danger and threat of the situation is immediately apparent. People are dying left, right and centre, and then you get into the compound and you have to make a literal life or death decision. Here, the game splits into 2 timelines. In one, you'll experience certain scenes and dialogue with Fergus, and in the other, Wyatt. However, it isn't the presence of the person you've saved that's really tangible here, it's the absence of the dead. If you played through both timelines, every scene with whoever you chose is just kind of spooky. There's a sort of ghost in the scene, the person you didn't save. Their absence is itself a presence. When I first played the New Order, I chose to save Fergus, and then I got to a scene near the middle of the game in which Fergus accuses Blazkowicz of making the wrong decision. He says he wishes it had been him, he wishes I'd saved Wyatt instead. I found this really powerful, because I kind of already felt bad about choosing to let Wyatt die, so I literally stopped the game and started over. This time I chose to save Wyatt, and when I reached the same point in the story, I kind of worried, well, what I was worried about happened, and Wyatt blamed Blazkowicz for choosing him as well. Wyatt thinks he made the wrong decision too. Wyatt, just like Fergus did, feels such powerful survivor's guilt. He yells at Blazkowicz and shoves him away and slams the door in his face. Then, as the game changed from cutscene to first-person perspective, and I saw through Blazkowicz's eyes again, I read the sign on Wyatt's door. It said, Betreten ist verboten, Lebensgefahr, which means entry forbidden, danger of death. The Lebensgefahr here was not a threat to your life as BJ Blazkowicz, but the sense of mortality that hangs over Wyatt and over the whole game. I talked about the dog scene in an essay before, but what's important to note here is, like the dog scene, the Fergus or Wyatt choice doesn't affect the plot of the game, but instead, the experience of the game for the player. In the New Order, the ocean could be read as a metaphor for a blissful death. After escaping Death's Head's compound, Blazkowicz drifts out to sea and the title sequence plays. In a way, he has died, the war is lost. Blazkowicz's attitude to death from the start is the classic macho, fearless stoicism. He doesn't care about his own life, he's committed to dying already, he just wants to take as many Nazis with him as possible. This attitude is pretty common among the resistance fighters, and it must intensify Wyatt's survivor's guilt. They're all committed to dying. In fact, when they attack London, Bobby Brown blows himself up and he tells Blazkowicz,
You make this count, alright?
Relating this back to earlier, this is because the fight against fascism is exhausting and grueling and awful. All they can eventually do is tap out and hope someone else completes the journey for them. When Blazkowicz is about to go up to face Death's Head at the end of the game, Anya tells him she believes there is still a good place in the world where people can be happy, and he replies that he agrees.
I believe so too. Not for me and for you.
This means that he views their struggle as necessarily ending in death, and that only one day after many more have died could there be a safe, happy place for people to live. After this, Blazkowicz goes up to face Death's Head, who reveals that he still has the brain of Fergus, or Wyatt, that he has preserved all this time. He inserts it into a killing machine, and Blazkowicz is forced to kill his friend in order to save himself and defeat Death's Head. Confronting Fergus there at the end, he says,
more control of my options.
This is basically how Blazkowicz feels too, and ties back again to my essay on Shadow of the Colossus and the powerlessness of violence. By being brought to this fascist Nazi future, B.J. Blazkowicz is essentially trapped in a violence machine, and the only way out is the endless dark depths, like the ocean of death. That's why, after being wounded in battle against Death's Head, with the nuclear cannon pointed at the compound, Blazkowicz gives his friends the all-clear to fire and kill him. And then, straight after, as the credits roll, we're looking through the water at pictures of the dead. Section 3. The Monomyth. In media analysis, people often talk about the hero's journey, an 8-part formula that supposedly underpins almost all stories that have a hero going on some sort of adventure. In the hero's journey, the character is step 1, in their familiar surroundings, but step 2, they want something. So step 3, they go to unfamiliar surroundings, and step 4, they have to adapt to them. Step 5, they finally get what they wanted, but step 6, they have to pay a great price to get it. In step 7, they return home, and step 8, they have changed. They've been changed by their journey. At the end of the journey, the change that the hero has gone through typically constitutes embracing their own mortality and the absurdity of life. In this way, it has been called a metaphor for Friedrich Nietzsche's life affirmation, in which someone reacts to the unpredictable nature of the universe by embracing it, and therefore conquers their fear of death. Joseph Campbell's original hero's journey, or Monomyth, had 17 steps, but that's just for nerds, so we'll be using the 8-step hero's journey generally, and then use the 17-step Monomyth when we want to get really specific. Wolfenstein: The New Order. Blazkowicz is step 1, fighting the war, but he, step 2, wants to win the war, or at least defeat Death's Head. He falls into a coma and wakes up step 3 in 1960s Nazi-ruled Europe, and he goes to find his people, step 4, the Resistance. Upon discovering Set, they find out about secret tech, step 5, that could let them win the war and even gain a Nazi nuclear sub, but then the base is attacked, step 6, and so Blazkowicz returns, step 7, to Death's Head's compound. But, step 8, now, as opposed to how we found him, he is a whole person, with friends, and a lover, and a fighting chance at winning the war. Now, he might have something to live for. But then he dies? I mean, until the sequel came around, that was the ending of The New Order. Blazkowicz defeats Death's Head, and he's a whole person, and he has something to live for, and then he dies. I'd like to stick a pin in that for a minute, and we'll come back to it shortly, if that's okay. It's also worth noting here that in the Monomyth, the 5th step is the belly of the whale, in which the protagonist is suddenly in the deepest possible part of the new, unfamiliar world. In The New Order, this step is when Blazkowicz has to go to Nazi Berlin, which is kind of a perfect example of the belly of the whale. I don't have anything to say about it, I just think that's so perfect. There's also a step 7, called Meeting the Goddess, where the protagonist receives helpful gifts from a supernatural force. In the old myths, often a goddess. I just think it's funny to note that the goddess in Wolfenstein is Set, the grouchy old man scientist. Now, the New Colossus. At the start of the New Colossus, Blazkowicz is step 1, among his friends on the stolen U-boat, but step 2, they want to free America, so he, step 3, travels to America, and step 4, recruits more people to the Resistance. They start to gain advantage over the Nazis, step 5. But in the process, step 6, he is literally killed and brought back to life. I mean literally, like Engel cuts his head all the way off. Finally, he returns to kill Engel, step 7, but he's healthy and somewhat happy and has a future to look forward to, so step 8. Oh, and also he's started a revolution to free America. Now here, it's worth noting that the Monomyth has a step 10, that expects death and rebirth, but that's usually a metaphor, so usually the hero will lose something very important and learns to live without it. But in the new Colossus, Blazkowicz literally dies and comes back to life. So now let me talk about the ending of the Monomyth. See, in the last 2 steps, the protagonist is supposed to learn to conquer their fear of death, and because they've done that, they're the master of 2 worlds, the spiritual and the physical, and they can live peacefully. If you're already thinking about how this applies to Wolfenstein, good job, I have nothing left to teach you, you can go start your own YouTube channel. But it might have occurred to you this doesn't really apply to our protagonist. See, somewhere before the start of the story, BJ Blazkowicz already conquered his fear of death. Both of the Wolfenstein games therefore subvert the Monomyth, by making the protagonist confront and conquer not his fear of death, but his fear of living. In the New Order, he meets and falls in love with Anya, and in the new Colossus she's pregnant, and he talks very explicitly in his internal monologue about his fear of her being unprovided for after he dies. But you could say his total acceptance of death shows that his real fear is living. This is, in a clever way, just as Nietzschean as the original Monomyth and the conquering of the fear of death. After all, Nietzsche saw the unpredictability and absurdity of life as the reason for the fear of death anyway. In this way, we can view the 2 worlds that the Monomyth talks about, the physical and spiritual, as Blazkowicz's life killing Nazis, and his life as a whole person. If we do this, the hero's journey could be viewed another way. Step 1, Blazkowicz is killing Nazis. Step 2, he wants to kill all the Nazis. Step 3, he winds up in the 60s where he meets Anya. Step 4, he falls in love with Anya. Step 5, he can defeat the Nazis, but Step 6, they've taken Anya, so Step 7, he returns to Death's Head compound where he was at the start, so now he's back in the physical world, as it were, his original place. Step 8, he has changed in that he now wants to live. But as we said before, he then, until it is revisited in the sequel, dies. So why does the New Order end like this? Well, there's an argument that it's just a tragic ending, or perhaps this is the New Order's stance on fighting fascism, that the ultimate sacrifice is a necessary part of it, or that it's simply the natural conclusion to the journey of someone who basically wants to die. However, I think it has more to do with Blazkowicz as a character, and what machine games are doing with that character, and with the Wolfenstein franchise in a wider sense. I think you can start to see this if you look at it from the point of view of a developer making a game that could either have a sequel or be a standalone. They need an ending that lets the character grow and find reasons to live, only if the audience of the game enjoyed their version of Wolfenstein enough to want more. After telling Anya they have no place in this world, BJ has a flashback into Fergus being dissected. The first time, in the game, the camera cut away when this happened, but now, in the flashback, we see everything. So the need to confront not only Death's Head but ourselves for the decision to sacrifice our friend is a fresh pain. In another interview, Matthias said,
"Our philosophy when we build the narrative is always to reveal whatever needs to be revealed to the protagonist and the player at the same time."
Which makes it strange that this information is revealed at different times. This is done very deliberately so that closure over Death's Head's murder of Fergus, or Wyatt, is reinforced as the goal. Then Blazkowicz reaches the top and has to confront it, literally. Fighting the robot that Fergus is trapped inside and then retrieving his brain and killing him. He then has to fight Death's Head himself and defeat him. Logically, this draws his loop to a close. He's back at where he was at the start, changed by the journey he's been on. So in terms of the hero's journey, why does he then die, despite learning to have something to live for? What is the ending of the New Order? The hero is in familiar surroundings, but they want something. They travel to a new place and have to adapt. Then they get what they want at a great price, and return to where they started, having changed. Where does the ending fit into that, and what is it? I think the ending to the New Order is a question mark on the end of the hero's journey. The hero returns to where they started. Having changed? Section 4. Passing the torch. The team who created New Order and New Colossus clearly love Wolfenstein. Like, they're massive Wolfenstein nerds. Machine Games pitched for the project twice, and on top of the continuation of some characters from older games, there are a couple of little nods to the old games. In New Order, there's a little secret passageway in Death's Head's compound, and the final boss battle against a Nazi in a big robot suit is kind of what Wolfenstein is most famous for. And we've been promised an appearance by Mecha Hitler in Wolfenstein 3. I bring this up because I think there's a strong case for the presence of a meta-narrative of New Order and New Colossus. That is to say, I haven't seen it discussed, and I'm not really confident it was intentional, so this is in part what I'd call an aggressive reading, which is where you disregard authorial intent to put forth a reading of a piece of media despite it. When Machine Games secured the Wolfenstein project, as discussed previously, they decided to give the character of Blazkowicz an interior psychology that was vulnerable and intimate. The sad thing about the games industry is that decision was essentially a bit of a gamble. It shouldn't be a gamble to create a well-rounded main character, but hey-ho, it was. Therefore, when they created New Order, they were creating a story about a character who always before has been a mindless Nazi-killing machine, but now was going to have real emotions and character. Because of that, the narrative where the character meets and falls in love with a woman and becomes more sensitive and, as I already said, conquers his fear of living, well, that's a meta-narrative. At the start of the New Order, Blazkowicz has a dream of a family cookout in the suburbs. 2 kids, a wife, him relaxing in a loud Hawaiian shirt on a deck chair. This feels like a really deliberate contrast to a scene in an earlier game by a different developer, where Blazkowicz's ideal holiday is just killing more Nazis. Here we get to see right away, BJ Blazkowicz wants to be a person. He wants to be a real boy. After the assault on Death's Head's compound, Blazkowicz slips into a coma, which he stays in for 14 years. He narrates how he can feel time slipping past him. I read this as a statement that Wolfenstein is out of date. There were other ways Machine Games could have sold their premise, Nazi world in the 1960s. They could have had Blazkowicz be born later, but instead they chose to sit the player down with Blazkowicz as the world slips him by. Blazkowicz only wakes up from his coma to go on a killing spree. In the scene where this happens, his washed-out greyish vision becomes full colour with every act of violence he witnesses. It's as if the game is telling us the only language he speaks is violence. He only gets up and properly returns when he gets his chance to stab a Nazi with some cutlery, escape to the asylum, and rescue Anya. I'll say it outright. This is patently ridiculous. Nobody's getting up from a 14-year coma and murdering 30 Nazis. But don't worry, we'll get back to that. Next, Blazkowicz starts to bond with Anya. He speaks Polish, he meets her family, they do some more bonding on the train to Berlin. Later in the game, near the end, Blazkowicz has another vision of his suburban life, but this time with Anya. This story of Blazkowicz coming to accept wanting a life with this woman could also, I think, be read as Wolfenstein as a franchise accepting its new incarnation, its new life, as a story with a real rounded character at its centre, as a franchise that could start to care. This is why I say that the New Order ends by asking, having changed? The ending in which Blazkowicz presumably dies doesn't necessarily preclude the possibility of a sequel. Well, I mean, after all, they did make a sequel. It does, however, neatly wrap up Machine Games' attempt, if nobody wanted it. If nobody had liked the new Blazkowicz and no one had bought it, and there hadn't been the money for a sequel, then Machine Games would have been able to say, we tried our best, we made something great, and shrug and move on. In fact, the attitude towards death throughout the first game almost feels like a reflection of this attitude. Blazkowicz is going to try his best, take as many Nazis with him as possible, and if he dies, then that's okay. He did his best. Coming back to the metaphor of the ocean as allegory for a blissful abyss, a peaceful death, this works too, maybe works a little better, in relation to the game itself. If nobody likes it, it will simply slip away into the ocean of content that is made and forgotten. But in some way, it will have made the world a better place anyway. At the end of the New Order, Blazkowicz watches from the window of Death's Head's compound as Anya, carrying a lantern, helps the prisoners escape. He's fatally wounded and resigns himself to a peaceful death. He recites the poem that appears at the base of the Statue of Liberty, The New Colossus, by Emma Lazarus.
Not like the brazen giant of Greek fame, with conquering limbs astride from land to land, here at our sea-washed sunset gates shall stand a mighty woman with a torch, whose flame is the imprisoned lightning, and her name, Mother of Exiles. From her beacon hand glows worldwide welcome. Her mild eyes command the air-bridged harbour that twin cities frame. Keep ancient lands, your storied pomp, cries she, with silent lips. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses, yearning to breathe free. The wretched refuse of your teeming shore, send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door.
And then he orders his friends to fire at the compound. And that's it, if nobody likes it. But people liked it, actually people loved it, so Machine Games had to come back and make a sequel, which makes this part of the meta-narrative quite interesting. The plots of the New Order and New Colossus are noticeably similar. So similar, in fact, the differences between them are even more noticeable. At the start of New Colossus, Blazkowicz is also extremely badly wounded, and he's been in a coma for a long time. Not 14 years this time, just several months. Can he jump up and kill a Nazi with a fork? You know he can't. The difference here, Blazkowicz is actually in a wheelchair, is so striking it feels like a direct message from the developer. Hey, that bit from the last game? That was too much. These games are silly, and that's all good, but that was too much. We want to correct some things in this game. From there, if you read New Colossus as setting out to correct some things from New Order, you get a pretty interesting picture. In New Colossus, Blazkowicz is captured and sentenced to death, but then he bursts out of his restraints and kills all the Nazis in the court building and finds his way into a little side room where he finds his mother, who's long dead, which is when you realize he's actually dreaming. He's fantasizing, because he can't escape. And so he's sentenced to death, and we as the player have to sit through the first-person perspective scene in which he's beheaded by General Engel. We watch her take his head and drop it 60 feet into a pit of fire, and we know we've completely lost. Instead of that being the end, the footage rewinds and it's revealed that Set and the others piloted a drone to catch his head and take it back to their base where they attach it to the body of a Nazi super soldier clone they stole. Perfect, cheesy, nonsense, beautiful, and at the heart of it all, don't get captured by Nazis. You won't break out of your restraints and kill them all. You'll just be executed. At the end of the game even, Blazkowicz faces the general who's been the antagonist all along. But this time, rather than a big fight on the top of a castle in a robot suit, he simply sneaks into the studio where Engel is being interviewed, and he kills her. It's effective, and it perfectly utilizes the unique element of surprise you could only have if your enemy had personally executed you, and had no idea you were still alive. Throughout New Colossus, this message is revised. In the New Order, it was, die trying your best. In the sequel, it's, live and try your best another day. Ultimately, the New Colossus ends up correcting the message of New Order into one that says to embrace life and keep living. This is because the arc of the New Order, as I said before, was about conquering that fear of living, but at the same time, accidentally or deliberately, it's also just good practical advice for fighting fascism, because you have to live so you can keep fighting. But why would the creators of a video game want to give advice on how to fight fascism? It's not like there's fascism going on in the world today. Is there? Section 5. Since when was killing Nazis political? The Berlin Memorial to the Murdered Jews of Europe, usually just called the Holocaust Memorial, is actually one of my favourite pieces of art. Because the physical construction of the memorial is an astonishingly clever execution of physical metaphor. The memorial comprises concrete blocks rising out of a stone floor, and the metaphor, although not direct allegory for one thing in particular, creates an analogous feeling that represents many different feelings relevant to remembrance of the Holocaust. The concrete blocks vary in size, generally smaller at the outside and taller in the middle. The blocks at the center are so tall that you feel trapped, pressed in between these uncaring, rigid, cold things. Once you've been through the center of the memorial and felt that unease, you return to the outside, the start of the sculpture. It might strike you that the first blocks, furthest out from the center, don't actually sit within the lot that the memorial occupies. They start sooner than you realize, and they start so small and low to the ground, you could just walk straight over them and never notice they were there. I knew some of this before I visited the memorial. What I didn't know was that as you walk into the sculpture, the floor itself also changes in height, going up and down, making the relative heights of the concrete obelisks change too, and with them, the impact of that feeling of claustrophobia. That too happens in such a way that you don't realize it at first. After all, it's hard to tell when the ground underneath your feet is the thing changing your perspective. Wolfenstein: The New Order was released in 2014. In 2014, killing Nazis was a very specific cliché in video games. In 2014, killing Nazis was exactly the kind of thing that people who didn't like video games would point to and say that they weren't a legitimate art form. In 2014, Obama was president, liberalism was in full swing, and Ebola was one of the top 10 political stories of the year, according to The Hill. In 2014, Gamergate was just beginning. In 2014, I knew my brother thought voting Labour was a good thing, vaguely. I had just started university, I didn't know what all these feminists were getting so upset for all the time. I felt very threatened by the people who were saying that the things I liked had big problems with them, especially when it kept getting more attention, especially when it didn't subside. And on some level, especially because I knew they were right, but I felt embarrassed by being called out, by them asking me to change. As it turned out, a lot of other people who also liked the things I liked also felt exactly how I felt, and that was Gamergate. Young white men were moving to protect the things they liked in 2014 and into 2015, and suddenly all these anti-feminists were getting popular on YouTube. Now, I personally never got into watching anti-feminist YouTubers. I liked to laugh at feminists on Tumblr who I thought were being ridiculous, but watching someone else do it made me think they were a bit sad and lame. Oh, now I'm thinking about it, that probably should have been some sort of clue. In 2015 though, I increasingly saw the people who were trying to stop feminists from ruining things also talk about how diversity was going to ruin things too. I started to see friends I'd gone to school with share around anti-immigrant media and kinda shitty hot takes that amounted to racism dressed up as a spicy meme. I started to think, you know, it's the conservatives who cut your sister's job as a nurse, dude, not the Muslims. By 2016, I'd see posts on Facebook and think, Romanian immigrants aren't the reason you can't find a job. There was a huge recession not that long ago, and the people in charge are doing everything to help big corporations instead of making more jobs. I can see that there were two political forces at play here, but I'm telling this from my point of view because it felt very connected at the time, and I hope that my experience translates for anyone watching who opposes racism and hates Nazis but also thinks feminists are just making a big fuss over nothing. In 2016, after losing some votes to UKIP in the previous year's general election, the Conservatives made a conscious effort to appeal more to far-right voters, and then shortly after held a referendum on whether we should stay in the EU or whether we should beat the hell out of our economy with a large stick until we have to sell our country to Google just to get out of the debt incurred from leaving the most profitable market we've ever been in. Following the Brexit vote, other countries started to look into having similar referendums, fueled by similar fear-mongering about immigration to that took place here. In America, liberalism had left lots of poor people out in the cold and was starting to squeeze the middle class too. So naturally, they needed a candidate who believed in actually investing in the people, in improving healthcare and creating jobs, who gave two shits about what ordinary people wanted. For some reason though, the Democrats decided to endorse Hillary Clinton. Online, I saw a lot more people shifting to the right, becoming less trusting of immigrants and even refugees. I saw the Gamergaters who I'd seen laughing at feminists before, now laughing at Hillary, peddling rhetoric from Trump's people and occasionally even saying "Make America Great Again." Offline, however, I saw every expectation that Hillary would win. I expected it myself, to be honest. When Hillary lost, however, retroactively, everything I'd seen came into sharp focus. Trump's voters divide roughly into thirds. One of those thirds have household incomes below the median average for the US, which would presumably make them the white working class that keeps getting blamed for his victory. But another third of his voters have household incomes above $100,000, which makes that pretty suspect to me. In his book, Ta-Nehisi Coates wrote an essay calling Trump America's first white president. In short, what he said is that while Clinton offered nothing that people were generally interested in, Trump was able to appeal to the identity of whiteness. In the absence of anything meaningful from the other side, people found racism to be better than nothing. The thing that the middle-class young white gamers who make up Gamergate and the working-class white people blamed for Trump's victory have in common, in my opinion, is a misplaced blame for bad circumstances. I've seen lots of working-class and lower-middle-class white people feeling hard done by because they can't get a job, or afford to get on the property ladder, or save up for the things that they want. But rather than blaming shithead conservative politicians who've been making such expertly wrong decisions you'd think they were actually trying to burn the country to the ground, they've started blaming foreigners. I've seen lots of Gamergaters feeling shunned and attacked by society, feeling like games aren't treated as legitimate and meaningful. But rather than blaming games journalists who are giving 10 out of 10 ratings for games with new shiny gun mechanics, they've been attacking the people who want to hold games up to the same standard as all other media. This brings us around to 2017 and the release of Wolfenstein 2: The New Colossus. At this point, I can't count the number of reviews I've seen that claim that A, they like the first game, B, they don't like this game, and C, it's because of the SJWs. As I've said in the previous section, the New Colossus is very similar to the New Order, except that it builds off the ideas from before in more interesting ways, and if anything, just explores its characters more. I've been talking about the period between 2014 and 2017 from my perspective, because while the right wing generally rose in that period all across the world, I became more left-wing. In 2014 I knew my brother was voting Labour, and I didn't get what all the feminists were on about, but by 2017 I was a socialist and a feminist, not to mention being much more entrenched in my anti-racist and anti-fascist beliefs. I wanted to point out that counterculture of becoming more left-wing because, although New Colossus is similar to New Order, Machine Games consciously added more left-wing stuff in this game. I'm talking generally about bits and bobs that were reactions to the response to the first game, including making Blazkowicz ancestrally Jewish, which adds a huge and really powerful political element to the game that had always been kind of deliberately skirted around before. But I'm talking particularly about Grace, the black feminist resistance leader, and Horton, the anarchist Marxist from the New Orleans ghetto. These characters were clearly written in response to the rising right-wing nonsense, but from where I'm standing, their inclusion shouldn't be enough to deeply offend players. Remember earlier when I quoted Jens Matthias saying, "The goal is not to have a protagonist that's so neutral you can project yourself into them. The goal is to have a protagonist that's so relatable you become them"? Well, in the game, Blazkowicz is initially skeptical of Grace's anti-racism and her feminism, and he outright yells at Horton, accusing him of being a navel-gazer who won't get his hands dirty. But if the player related to the protagonist in the way that Matthias hopes, they'd do what Blazkowicz does, and basically grow up and get over it. The issue here, as far as I can tell, isn't the differences between the game and its predecessor. The issue is where these players are coming at the game from. If they're starting from a more right-wing place than they were before, the game is going to seem much more radical. It is really important to note that the New Colossus actually messed up on the issue of class. In the game, there are representations of the KKK which make them out to be stupid and incompetent, which, to be clear, I'm cool with representing racists as incompetent idiots. The problem starts to become apparent when you contrast the Klansmen to the Nazis. In reality, the Nazis were stupid and badly organized and constantly infighting. In reality, the Nazis often rode into battle on horses because they neither had enough equipment nor utilized it well. In reality, some of the Klansmen were middle or upper-class educated men, most notably, of course, the father of the current President of the United States.
I've heard enough. No more.
In reality, both posed a genuine and serious threat to the lives of racial minorities. A really key difference between these two groups of bigots is that the Nazis were in charge of a nation, while the Klan have only ever been essentially a cult. A nation has the power to create propaganda, and create propaganda the Nazis surely did. In his video about propaganda, Dan Olsen pointed out that the idea we have of the Nazis is the one they wanted us to have of them. That's my problem with Wolfenstein 2: New Colossus. It buys into that idea of the Nazis as cruel, cold, inhumane, sure, but also efficient, intelligent, and powerful. So why does it matter? New Colossus isn't the wokest thing under the sun, and it doesn't avoid classism. It's still pretty good, right? Well, no. White supremacists have quite a history of positioning racial minorities as the opponents of the white working class. Their conspiracy theory, white genocide, is basically that Jewish elites are manipulating policy and economics to bring in immigrants who will work for less money than the white working class, depressing wages, kicking them out of their jobs, and then replacing them. Now, naturally that sounds pretty nuts, but to get people to buy into it, they strip away the parts they know people won't accept until they reach a version of it that people can start with and build it up from there. You don't believe the secret conspiracy of Jews? Okay, well, globalists are manipulating the economy. You don't buy that? Okay, well, nobody's manipulating it. Immigrants are just ruining our economy by being there. You don't believe me? Well, you'll agree immigrants aren't making things worse. You don't? Well, at the very least, you'll agree things are pretty tough for working class Joes like you and me. In this strategy, the cornerstone of agreement is appeal to the white working class. So, when you're making a game in which the bad guys are white supremacists, and you're trying to be as inclusive and diverse as possible, and you're releasing it in 2017 after the election of an openly racist president whose victory has been blamed on the white working class by practically everyone on the left, cutting the jokes at the expense of those dumb southern hicks in favor of a more nuanced take might have been in everyone's best interest. If you want a more nuanced take on the white working class in America, I really strongly recommend you read White Trash, a 400-year untold history of class in America by Nancy Eisenberg. I'm reading it and I'm going to be basing some things I talk about in my Bloodborne essay on it, and it's honestly fantastic. If you want a more detailed understanding of who's been oppressing the white working class for centuries, spoiler, it's the white upper class, then I really can't recommend you read it strongly enough. What New Colossus does do well, though, is shift from being a game where the player kills Nazis and shoots Nazis and punches Nazis, to being a more practical approach to how to defeat fascism. In New Order, the objective is to take as many Nazis with you as possible before you get taken out, and it ends with a big fight against a Nazi in a mecha suit. In New Colossus, however, the objective is to incite revolution and reclaim America, so it ends with Blazkowicz and pals commandeering a television station to make a big speech to the whole nation and thereby liberate them. And I think that kicks ass! Slavoj Žižek has talked about state-condoned rebellion, essentially things that society is comfortable with you saying, even though it goes against popular opinion, but it still flatters them in another way. I'd say Kurt Vonnegut, even though I love him, takes part in this, being one of the edgy American writers who liked to point out Washington-owned slaves. This fact doesn't tear down American democracy, because part of the American mythos is that people in the past were of their times, and theories of liberty from historical figures were hypocritical, and therefore theories about treating everyone equally are just a bit too idealistic. What doesn't sit comfortably with the American mythos is pointing out the closeted white nationalism of Republicans in recent decades and even now, and the open white nationalism of the current administration. It didn't sit right with a lot of Americans when Bethesda's marketing team tweeted, "Make America Nazi-free again." A lot of gamers who had become Trump supporters got angry about this tweet, despite the fact that the objective of the game is literally to make America Nazi-free again. Let me be clear about this. You could see that tweet as being in line with Trump's objective to make America great. You could see Nazi-free and great as the same. You could do that if you didn't know what Trump was really about. But we all do. We know that Nazis marched in the streets of America in 2017, and as I'm recording this, they're planning to do it in 2 days again. If you don't know that, please watch this video. A few years ago, when I was decidedly not a feminist, a friend sent me something that said, if someone is pointing out the behavior of men who are behaving shittily, and that offends you as a man, you need to think about why. Naturally enough, being a radical shithead at the time, I got offended by it. I was wrong. I was associating those bad behaviors with being a man, and I shouldn't have been, because ultimately that's a kind of self-hatred. If those behaviors were part of being a man, I'd want to stop being a man. They aren't. I can't. But you can stop supporting Trump. So now I can say this. If someone says Nazis are bad, and that offends you as a Trump supporter, you need to think about why. To be clear, the primary criticisms of New Colossus weren't for having bad stereotypes of the white working class or people from the South. They weren't even for having what I'm sure a lot of players think of as a less fun ending. I've seen those criticisms, but they were never the main thrust, the real problem people have with the game. The main issues people have with the New Colossus are the same as they have with any other game that they think the SJWs got to. It's that the game contains a black woman who speaks her mind and is the leader of a group. It's that the game has unnecessary diversity and is part of the progressive agenda. It's telling that a lot of these reviews call New Colossus part of a trend of SJW games, because that's exactly it. As soon as these guys have labelled a game as being part of this trend, they try their hardest to find any reason to hate it. They don't hate the New Order though, even though at its core it isn't that different, because they remember it from a time before they became radicalized. After all, it's hard to tell when the ground underneath your feet is the thing changing your perspective. Section 6. Mother of Exiles.
Just remember, my boy, it will end better than it began.
In this section, I'm going to wrap up my deep dive analysis of Wolfenstein before I go on to write 7 more sections on the prevalence of gut punch storytelling and why I think Wolfenstein does it better than any other game. Before we go though, I'd like to wrap up what I've been discussing. PhilosophyTube has a great video called Why the Left Will Win. In it, Ollie talks about communities of vulnerability and communities of strength, as discussed by Stacey Clifford Simplican. Communities of strength are united, or attempt to be united, by common strength, or an identity relying on power, and because they rely on strength or power, they have to remain powerful and hide their shame, or they'll fall apart. Communities of vulnerability are united by common needs, or vulnerability. Because communities of vulnerability have nothing to lose, because they come together to solve a problem, they're inherently stronger, and inherently harder to stop. Nazis have been reaching out to people in communities of vulnerability, oppressed working class people, even gamers who feel under attack from feminism, and trying to co-opt that community and bring people into a community of strength. They lose people along the way as those people realize they're Nazis, or need the community of vulnerability more, or just basically don't want to be in a community that spends all its energy all the time on attacking people. Wolfenstein shows this pretty well. In the New Order, all the members of the Resistance need to get rid of the Nazis personally to survive, or have a loved one who does. In New Colossus, they are able to reach out to the rest of the country and extend their community of vulnerability to them, because practically everyone is miserable under fascism. Blazkowicz actually says in the trailer for Wolfenstein Youngblood,
It's not about the pain you can deal. It's about how much you can take.
This line, although obviously produced to be a cool, grim line for a game trailer, actually reflects a community of vulnerability and its advantage over a community of strength pretty well. Communities of strength have absolutely zero resilience. As I said earlier, New Colossus is about how to actually overthrow fascism, which is why the story proper ends with the Resistance taking over the TV network, rather than dying in a big fight with a mecha villain. Blazkowicz takes the safest, most sensible opportunity to get the drop on Engel and kill that fucker dead. After you finish the story proper, you play a series of missions taking out Nazi commandants in various different levels you played earlier. At the end of these extended missions, you play a new level that you've never seen before in New York. In this level, you have to fight various Nazi robots in almost pitch darkness until you can find your way out of this underground maze to a pier, where your target is standing alone, guarded by one last big robot. Killing him doesn't trigger a second credits roll or a new cutscene. It just leaves you there on the shore, looking across the remains of Liberty Island, and the huge torch still somehow held above the waves. Where New Order ended with Blazkowicz reciting the poem The New Colossus, Wolfenstein 2 ends with him actually looking out across the sea at the New Colossus, the Statue of Liberty, the Mother of Exiles. Where New Order used the ocean as a metaphor for blissfully passing away, drifting out to sea and out to oblivion, New Colossus ends with America won back from tyranny, and you, as Blazkowicz, looking out across the sea at hope on the horizon. I'd like to thank Hann The Mann, who made the awesome music for Curio, as well as various friends who provided audio for this. I'd also like to thank you, the viewer, for watching this all the way to the end. This video is actually part of a pair, so if you liked this one, you might enjoy the other one, where I argue the Wolfenstein are the best games ever made in a certain way. If you're a dedicated fan, you might be interested in supporting us regularly on Patreon, or tipping us on Ko-Fi. Coffee? I don't know how to say this fucking word. If you had a brief burst of excitement when I mentioned Kurt Vonnegut, then I think you're going to like my Bloodborne essay, which is my next video game analysis.